Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. Behind me is a statue of King Charles II. So it's on Parliament Square in Edinburgh. Anyway, perhaps this angle gives you a better idea of what it looks like. An equestrian statue. You can see he's got one hoof up, his horse. There is some sort of code for these equestrian statues depending on which hoof is up. It tells you something about them, whether they died in battle or not. I don't remember the rest. And it's got a Latin inscription on the plinth saying, the most august and most magnificent Charles II of Britain, France and Ireland, monarch unconquered, most unconquered, and so on, by whose providential birth, and all the rest of it. And it's actually quite lengthy. It mentions his war against Batavia, as in the Netherlands. Charles II, he was born in 1630 in London, and his mother was Henrietta Maria, a French princess, and his father was Charles I. So Henrietta Maria's brother, Louis XIII, King of France, he'd had problems with his pesky parliament, and what he'd done is he'd simply banned the Estates General, that was the French parliament, and executed the more irritating politicians. That's it, rule by fiat. And Charles I was saying, I like the sound of that. Another thing is Henry Maria's father, he converted from Protestantism to Catholicism, saying, Paris vaut bien une messe. Paris is worth a mass, which led many people to think that Henrietta Maria is using her feminine wiles to persuade her husband to turn the British Isles Catholic. Of course, in Ireland, most of us remained Catholic, but officially the country was Protestant, as in Church of Ireland. That didn't happen. There was the English Civil War, wars in all the countries of the British Isles, and Charles II managed to escape early in the war. He was in Jersey, where he had a mistress called Lucy Waters, had a son with her, James, who was later made Duke of Monmouth. Anyway, Charles II, he was in the Netherlands. He didn't live in great comfort, couldn't afford to pay the bills all the time. And finally, in 1660, that April, he made the Declaration of Breda, named after the city of Netherlands, where he said, I forgive my father's foes, I shall exact no vengeance on those who committed regicide. And I recognized a new political dispensation. So May 1660, he returned to England and was hailed there. He'd made an attempt to stage a comeback in Scotland. Cromwell had come up to Scotland to crush Charles II. Charles II had engaged with the people of Scotland, made an engagement saying, I accept the Church of Scotland is Presbyterian, and all the rest of it. No prayer book for Scotland. You can have your decidedly Protestant version of Christianity. We're not going to have no truck with Arminianism. No, nothing which even smacks of Catholicism. But anyway, Cromwell had defeated him. Charles II had fled. He'd made another attempt to come back in England. 1651, the Battle of Worcester, and he was defeated. So he fled, and people were told to look out for Charles Stuart, who was 2 yards high, as in 6 feet. Now, 6 feet, that's almost my height. That's well above average these days, but back in the 17th century, that was almost a giant. And Charles II, he bumped into someone who said to him, have you seen that Charles Stuart? He's 2 yards high. What a blackguard, the wretch should be hanged by the neck. Something along those lines. And Charles II was thinking, I hope he doesn't realise it's me. I stick out like a sore thumb, because he was so tall and not many people had horses that were so well dressed. But anyway, he got to Boscobel House, and parliamentarian soldiers were searching for him. That's Cromwell's men. Charles II climbed an oak tree and hid there, and that's how he made good his escape. That's why there are many pubs around called the Royal Oak, and if you look carefully on the signs outside these pubs, look at the oak trees, you will see a face hiding in the leaves, as in that's Charles II. That's what saved his neck, and that's why their warship's called the Royal Oak. So here's Charles II in the guise of a Roman general. You can see the laurel wreath, the breastplate, the sword. Even look at the saddle, and there are no stirrups, because of course we didn't have stirrups in the 11th century. The Normans invented those, which proved to be a great aid to them at the time of the Battle of Hastings. And then in one hand, some sort of rolled up scroll. Maybe that's his engagement with the people of Scotland. So Charles II, he came back in 1660, accepted in Scotland as well as in England, Wales, Ireland. He visited Ireland, but he had no difficulty regaining control of Ireland. Anyway, he promptly broke his solemn undertaking, and he hunted down many regicides, as in people who had signed the death warrant of his father, Charles I, and he had them executed. Some of them managed to evade justice by going abroad. A few of them who grovelled and proved useful to him had their lives spared. And that was that. So yes, he was an Anglican, he kept the Church of England going. However, he married Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess. She came over, he offered her a mug of beer to drink. She said no thanks, she'd rather have tea. Tea, what on earth is that? It's the 1660s. That's a drink all the way from China. And she's the one who introduced tea into this country. But she brought with her a very worthwhile wedding present. It was called Mumbai. Yes, that city in India. But back then it was called Bombaia by the Portuguese, as in good bay, anglicised to Bombay. Charles II had about 20 children, but none of them with his wife. He was a notorious libertine, so he had children with lots of ladies, and his sons he would give aristocratic titles to, and his daughters he would marry to noblemen. He'd say more or less order these aristocrats to marry his daughters who were born outside of wedlock. So that was Charles I. His wife was obviously infertile because he most certainly wasn't. So many aristocrats in the British Isles are descended from him. Princess Diana was, therefore Prince William. And the Duke of St Albans was among many of those who were raised to these noble titles because their ancestresses were women of easy virtue. Anything else about Charles II? So there were some wars against the Netherlands because it was a major maritime rival. There had been some wars against them under Cromwell. You would have thought Charles II might have been grateful to the people of the Netherlands for sheltering him when he was in a time of trouble, when he was in exile, but oh no. These were obviously wars about trade with the East Indies and so forth, and in the Caribbean. Anything else about Charles II? Yeah. So he lived in great opulence, he brought back fun. Remember 1666 was the Great Fire of London. Some people said 666, the number of the beast. They thought, is it the devil behind this? Is it divine retribution on our monarch's louche lifestyle? Or Catholics were blamed for doing it. You go to the monument in London, near Pudding Mill Lane where it started, and the monument says that Catholics started this because there was a severe anti-Catholic prejudice in Great Britain at the time. And of course his wife was a Catholic, being from Portugal. So then who was going to be the next heir to the throne, as he had no children who were born inside matrimony? His younger brother, James II, the Duke of York. Remember, the younger brother of the younger son of the monarch gets the title Duke of York. The eldest one gets the title Prince of Wales. So it was going to be the Duke of York. So there were several attempts to exclude him. Now, Parliament didn't always meet in London, the English and Welsh Parliament. By the way, under Charles II, the Scots Parliament come back, which is why this statue was here. The English and Welsh Parliament met at Oxford. The Parliament met wherever the King summoned them to meet. Usually London, but in this case it was Oxford. And at that Parliament, some people proposed the Exclusion Bill to exclude James II because he'd come out to the open, yes, he was a Roman Catholic. And people thought, oh, horror of horrors, we can't possibly accept that. It's this fashionable Satanism of Rome. So lots of anti-Catholic bigots around. In fairness, many Catholics were bigoted against Protestants, so if people belonged to the minority religion, they were persecuted, often executed in those days. Germany had just come out of the 30 Years' War, where up to a third of the German population had been slaughtered for their religious denomination. So these hair-splitting doctrinal differences made a very grave difference in those days, with the emphasis on the grave. So Parliament passed that Exclusion Act. However, Charles II would not have it said, le roi le veut, as in the king wants it. And with those words, that said he signed it, he's approved of it, it did not receive royal assent, as in the King's agreement, so it didn't pass. What are you going to do? Okay, because it's the Crown and Parliament is what governs, that the monarch has to agree. And up until this time, well, monarchs for a couple of decades have been agreeing, well, after Charles I's fiasco. So he challenged them, do you want another civil war? And nobody in his right mind wanted the bloody anarchy, which had transpired for at least 10 years because of the Civil War. So they backed down and they grumbled. James II was not going to be excluded. Charles II did have some supporters in Parliament at this time, so those who were excluders wanted to exclude James II, those were abhorrers who abhorred the idea of excluding James II, divine right of kings. James II is of the blood royal, and he's born inside holy matrimony. There can be no question about his title to the crown after the decease of his brother. So in 1685, Charles II was summoned to the great big orgy in the sky, and his junior brother James II ascended to the throne. Of course, in Scotland, he's James VII, and he was a Catholic. Actually, on his deathbed, Charles II converted to Catholicism as well. So that's that. Could a Roman Catholic monarch successfully govern a Protestant nation? Well, Scotland had had that experience before under Mary Queen of Scots in 1660, and you all remember how that ended.